Chapter 11. They adjourned to a small tavern 3 doors down 68th Avenue from the old games parlor, an old-fashioned tavern with manually operated doors and stuffed moose heads over the bar. Alan and Hawks took seats next to each other in a booth in back. Steve sat facing them. The barkeep came scuttling out, no robot here, just a tired-faced old man, and took their orders. Hawks called for beer, Steve for whiskey. Alan did not order. He sat staring at his brother's oddly changed face. Steve was 26. From Alan's 17-year-old vantage point, he seemed tremendously old, well past the prime of life. He said, "The Valhalla landed on Earth a few days ago. We're bound out for Procyon in a few days." "So?" "The captain would like to see you again, Steve." Steve stared moodily at his drink without speaking for a long moment. Alan studied him. Less than 2 months had passed for Alan since Steve had jumped ship. He still remembered how his twin had looked. There had been something smoldering in Steve's eyes then, a kind of rebellious fire, a smoky passion. That was gone now. It had burned out long ago. In its place, Alan saw only tiny red veins, the bloodshot eyes of a man who had been through a lot, little of it very pleasant. "Is that the truth?" Steve asked. "Would he like to see me? Or wouldn't he just prefer to think I was never born at all?" "No. I know the captain, Dad, pretty well, even though I haven't seen him in 9 years. He'd never forgive me for jumping ship. I don't want to pay any visits to the Valhalla, Alan." "Who said anything about visiting?" "Then what were you talking about?" "I was talking about going back into the crew," Alan said quietly. The words seemed to strike Steve like physical blows. He shuddered a little and gulped down the drink he had clenched in his tobacco-stained fingers. He looked up at Alan finally. "I can't. It's impossible. Flatly impossible." "But—" Alan felt Hawk's foot kick him sharply under the table. He caught the hint and changed the subject. There was time to return to it later. "Okay, let's skip it for now. Why don't you tell me about your life on Earth these past 9 years?" Steve smiled sardonically. "There's not much to tell, and what there is a pretty dull story. I came across the bridge from the Enclave last time the Valhalla was in town, and came over into York City, all set to conquer the world, become rich and famous, and live happily ever after. 5 minutes after I set foot on the Earther side of the river, I was beaten up and robbed by a gang of roving kids. It was a real fine start." He signaled the waiter for another drink. "I guess I must have drifted around the city for 2 weeks or more before the police found me and picked me up for vagrancy. By that time the Valhalla had long since hoisted up for Alpha C, and didn't I wish I was on it. Every night I used to dream I had gone back on the ship, but when I woke up I always found out I hadn't. The police gave me an education in the ways of Earther life, complete with rubber hoses and stingrays, and when they were through with me I knew all about the system of work cards and free status. I didn't have a credit to my name, so I drifted some more. Then I got sick of drifting and tried to find a job, but of course I couldn't buy my way into any of the hereditary guilds. Earth has enough people of her own. She's not interested in finding jobs for kid spacemen who jump ship. So I starved a little, then I got tired of starving. So about a year after I first jumped ship, I borrowed 1,000 credits from somebody foolish enough to lend them, and set myself up as a professional gambler on free status. It was the only trade I could find that didn't have any entrance requirements." "Did you do well?" "Yeah, very well. At the end of my first 6 months I was 1,500 credits in debt. Then my luck changed. I won 3,000 credits in a single month and got shifted up to Class B." Steve laughed bitterly. "That was beautiful, up there. Inside of 2 more months I'd not only lost my 3,000, I was 2,000 more in hock. And that's the way it's been going ever since. I borrow here, win a little to pay 'em back, or lose a little and borrow from someone else, win a little, lose a little, round and round and round. A swell life, Alan, and I still dream about the Valhalla once or twice a week." Steve's voice was leaden, dreary. Alan felt a surge of pity. The swashbuckling, energetic Steve he had known might still be there, inside this man somewhere, but surrounding him were the scars of 9 bitter years on Earth. 9 years. It was a tremendous gulf. Alan caught his breath a moment. If you had the chance to go back into the crew, no strings attached, no recriminations, would you take it? For an instant the old brightness returned to Steve's eyes. "Of course I would, but—" "But what?" "I owe 7,000 credits," Steve said, "and it keeps getting worse. That pot I won today, just before you came over to me, that was the first take I'd had in 3 days. 9 years and I'm still a Class C gambler. We can't all be as good as Hawks here. But I'm lousy. But what other profession could I go into on an overcrowded and hostile world like this one?" 7,000 credits, Alan thought. It was a week's earnings for Hawks, but Steve would probably be in debt the rest of his life. "Who do you owe this money to?" Hawks asked suddenly. Steve looked at him. "The Bryson Syndicate mostly, and Lorne Hollis. The Bryson people keep a good eye on me too. There's a Bryson man 3 booths up who follows me around. If they ever saw me going near the space field, they'd be pretty sure to cut me off and ask for their money. You can't welsh on Bryson." "Suppose it was arranged that your debts could be canceled," Hawks said speculatively. Steve shook his head. "No, I don't want charity. I know you're a Class A and 7,000 credits comes easy to you. But I couldn't take it. Skip it, I'm stuck here on Earth for keeps, and I'm resigned to it. I made my choice, and this is what I got." "Listen to reason," Alan urged. "Hawks will take care of the money you owe, and Dad will be so happy for you to come back to the ship again. Like Mars he'll be happy. See me come back, beaten up and ragged, a washed-out old man at 26? No, sir. The captain blotted me out of his mind a long time ago, and he and I don't have any further business together." "You're wrong, Steve. He sent me into the Earther City deliberately to find you. He said to me, 'Find Steve and urge him to come back to the ship.' He's forgiven you completely," Alan lied. "Everyone's anxious to have you come back on board." For a moment Steve sat silent, indecisive, frowning deeply. Then he made up his mind. He shook his head. "No, both of you. Thanks, but I don't want any. Keep your 7,000, Hawks. And you, Alan, go back to the ship and forget all about me. I don't even deserve a second chance." "You're wrong," Alan started to protest, but a second time Hawks kicked him hard and he shut up. He stared curiously at the gambler. "I guess that about settles it," Hawks observed. "If the man wants to stay, we can't force him." Steve nodded. "I have to stay on Earth, and now I better get back to the games parlor. I can't waste any time, you know. Not with a 7,000 credit backlog to make up." "Naturally, but there's time for one more drink, isn't there? On me. Maybe you don't want my money, but let me buy you a drink." Steve grinned. "Fair enough." He started to wave to the bartender, but Hawks shot out an arm quickly and blocked off the gesture. "He's an old man and he's tired. I'll go to the bar and order." And before Steve could protest, Hawks had slipped smoothly out of the booth and was on his way forward to the bar. Alan sat facing his brother. He felt pity. He had been through a lot. The freedom he had longed for aboard ship had had a heavy price. And was it freedom? To sit in a crowded games parlor on a dirty little planet and struggle to get out of debt? There was nothing further he could say to Steve. He had tried and he had failed, and Steve would remain on Earth. But it seemed wrong. Steve did deserve a second chance. He had jumped ship and it had been a mistake, but there was no reason why he could not return to his old life, wiser for the experience. Still, if he refused... Hawks came back bearing 2 drinks, another beer for himself, and a whiskey for Steve. He set them out on the table and said, "Well, drink up. Here's hoping you make Class A and stay there." "Thanks," Steve said, and drained his drink in a single loud gulp. His eyes widened, and he started to say something, but never got the words out. He slumped down in his seat, and his chin thumped ringingly against the table. Alan looked at Hawks in alarm. What happened to him? Why'd he pass out? Hawks smiled knowingly. "An ancient Earth beverage known as a Mickey Finn. 2 drops of a synthetic enzyme in his drink. Tasteless but extremely effective. He'll be asleep for 10 hours or more." "How'd you arrange it?" "I told the bartender it was in a good cause, and he believed me. You wait here now. I want to talk to that Bryson man about your brother's debts. Then we'll spirit him out to the spaceport and dump him aboard the Valhalla before he wakes up." Alan grinned. He was going to have to do some explaining to Steve later, but by that time it would be too late. The starship would be well on its way to Procyon. It was a dirty trick to play, he thought, but it was justifiable. In Hawk's words, it was in a good cause. Alan put his arms around his brother's shoulders and gently lifted him out of the chair. Steve was surprisingly light for all his lack of condition. Evidently muscles weighed more than fat, and Steve had gone to fat. Supporting his brother's bulk without much trouble, Alan made his way toward the entrance to the bar. As he went past the bartender, the old man smiled at him. Alan wondered what Hawks had said to him. Right now, Hawks was 3 booths up, leaning over and taking part in an urgent, whispered conference with a thin, dark-faced man in a sharply tailored suit. They reached some sort of agreement. There was a handshake. Then Hawks left the booth and slung one of Steve's dangling arms around his own shoulder, easing the weight. "There's an undertube that takes us as far as Carhill Boulevard and the bridge," Hawks said. "We can get a ground vehicle there that'll go through the Enclave and out to the space field." The trip took nearly an hour. Steve sat propped up between Alan and Hawks, and every now and then his head would loll to one side or the other, and he would seem to be stirring, but he never woke. The sight of 2 men dragging a third along between them attracted not the slightest attention as they left the undertube and climbed aboard the Spacefield bus. Apparently in York City, no one cared much about what went on. It made no difference to the busy Earthers whether Steve were unconscious or dead. The ground bus took them over the majestic arch of the bridge, rapidly through the sleeping Enclave. Alan saw nobody he recognized in the streets, and through the restricted area that led to the space field. The spaceport was a jungle of ships, each standing on its tail waiting to blast off. Most of them were small 2-man cargo vessels, used in travel between Earth and the colonies on the Moon, Mars, and Pluto, but here and there a giant starship loomed high above the others. Alan stood on tiptoes to search for the golden hull of the Valhalla, but he was unable to see it. Since the starship would be blasting off at the end of the week, he knew the crew was probably already at work on it, shaping it up for the trip. He belonged on it, too. He saw a dark green starship standing nearby, the Encounter, Kevin Quantrell's ship. Men were moving about busily near the big ship, and Alan remembered that it had become obsolete during its last long voyage and was being rebuilt. A robot came sliding up to the 3 of them as they stood there at the edge of the landing field. "Can I help you, please?" "I'm from the starship Valhalla," Alan said. "I'm returning to the ship. Would you take me to the ship, please?" "Of course." Alan turned to Hawks. The moment had come, much too suddenly. Alan felt Rat twitching at his cuff, as if reminding him of something. Grinning awkwardly, Alan said, "I guess this is the end of the line, Max. You better not go out on the space field with us. I sort of want to thank you for all the help you've given me. I never would have found Steve without you. And about the bet we made, well, it looks like I'm going back on my ship after all, so I've won 1,000 credits from you. But I can't ask for it, of course, not after what you did for Steve." He extended his hand. Hawks took it, but he was smiling strangely. "If I owed you the money, I'd pay it to you," the gambler said. "That's the way I work. The 7,000 I paid for Steve is extra and above everything else. But you haven't won that bet yet. You haven't won it until the Valhalla's in space with you aboard it." The robot made signs of impatience. Hawks said, "You'd better convoy your brother across the field and dump him on the ship. Save the goodbyes for later. I'll wait right here for you. Right here." Alan shook his head. "Sorry, Max, but you're wasting your time by waiting. The Valhalla has to be readied for blastoff, and once I check in aboard ship, I can't come back out to visit. So this is goodbye, right here." "We'll see about that," Hawks said. 10-to-1 odds." 10-to-1, Alan said, "and you've lost your bet." But his voice did not sound very convincing, and as he started off across the field with Steve dragging along beside him, he frowned, and did some very intense thinking indeed in the few minutes' time it took to arrive at the shining Valhalla. He was beginning to suspect that Hawks might be going to win the bet after all. Chapter 12. He felt a little emotional pang, something like nostalgia, as the Valhalla came into sight, standing by itself, tall and proud, at the end of the field. A cluster of trucks buzzed around it, transferring fuel, bringing cargo. He spotted the wiry figure of Dan Kelleher, the cargo chief, supervising and shouting salty instructions to the perspiring men. Alan tightened his grip on Steve's arm and moved forward. Kelleher shouted, "You men back there, tighten up on that winch and give her a hoist. Tighten up, I say. Put some muscle into—" He broke off. "Alan?" he said in a quiet voice. "Hello, Dan. Is my father around?" Kelleher was staring with frank curiosity at the slumped figure of Steve Donnell. "The captain's off watch now. Art Candon's in charge." "Thanks," Alan said. "I better go see him." "Sure, and—" Alan nodded. "Yes, that's Steve." He passed between the cargo hoists and clambered onto the escalator rampway that led up to the main body of the ship. It rose, conveying him 70 feet upward and through the open passenger hatch to the intersection of the towering starship. He was weary from having carried Steve so long. He put the sleeping form down against a window seat facing one of the view screens and said to Rat, "You stay here and keep watch. If anyone wants to know who he is, tell them the truth." "Right enough." Alan found Art Candon where he expected to find him, in the central control room, posting work assignments for the blastoff tomorrow. The lanky, pudgy-faced first officer hardly noticed as Alan stepped up beside him. "Art?" Candon turned and went pale. "Oh, Alan. Where the blazes have you been the last 2 days?" "Out in the Earther city. Did my father make much of a fuss?" The first officer shook his head. "He kept saying you just went out to see the sights, that you hadn't really jumped ship. But he kept saying it over and over again, as if he didn't really believe it, as if he wanted to convince himself you were coming back." "Where is he now?" "In his cabin. He's off watch for the next hour or two. I'll ring him up and have him come down here, I guess." Alan shook his head. "No, don't do that. Tell him to meet me on B deck." He gave the location of the picture view screen where he had parked Steve, and Candon shrugged and agreed. Alan made his way back to the view screen. Rat looked up at him. He was sitting perched on Steve's shoulder. Anyone bother you? Alan asked. No one's come by this way since you left, Rat said. Alan? A quiet voice said. Alan turned. Hello, Dad. The captain's lean, tough face had some new lines on it. His eyes were darkly shadowed, and he looked as if he hadn't slept much the night before. But he took Alan's hand and squeezed it warmly in a fatherly way, not a captainly way. Then he glanced at the sleeping form behind Alan. I went into the city, Dad, and found Steve. Something that looked like pain came into Captain Donnell's eyes, but only for an instant. He smiled. It's strange seeing the two of you like this. So you brought Steve back, eh? We'll have to put him back on the roster. Why is he asleep? He looks like he's out cold. He is, Dad. It's a long story. You'll have to explain it to me later then, after blastoff. Alan shook his head. No, Dad. Steve can explain it when he wakes up tonight. Steve can tell you lots of things. I'm going back to the city. What? It was easy to say now. The decision that had been taking vague form for several hours, and which had crystallized as he trudged across the space field toward the Valhalla. I brought you back Steve, Dad. You still have one son aboard ship. I want off. I'm resigning. I want to stay behind on Earth. By our charter, you can't deny such a request. Captain Donnell moistened his lips slowly. Agreed, I can't deny. But why, Alan? I think I can do more good Earthside. I want to look for Cavor's old notebooks. I think he developed the hyperdrive, and if I stay behind on Earth, maybe I can find it. Or else I can build my own. So long, Dad. And tell Steve that I wish him luck, and that he'd better do the same for me. He glanced at Rat. Rat, I'm deeding you to Steve. Maybe if he had you instead of me, he never would have jumped ship in the first place. He looked around, at his father, at Steve, at Rat. There was not much else he could say. And he knew that if he prolonged the farewell scene too long, he'd only be burdening his father and himself with the weight of sentimental memory. We won't be back from Procyon for almost 20 years, Alan. You'll be 37 before we return to Earth again. Alan grinned. I have a hunch I'll be seeing you all before then, Dad. I hope. Give everyone my best. So long, Dad. So long, Alan. He turned away and rapidly descended the ramp, avoiding Kelleher and the cargo crew, for goodbyes would take too long, and he trotted smoothly over the space field, feeling curiously light-hearted now. Part of the quest was over. Steve was back on board the Valhalla. But Alan knew the real work was just beginning. He would search for the hyperdrive. Perhaps Hawks would help him. Maybe he would succeed in his quest this time, too. He had some further plans in that event, but it was not time to think of them now. Hawks was still standing at the edge of the field, and there was a thoughtful smile on his face as Alan came running up to him. I guess you won your bet, Alan said, when he had his breath back. I almost always do. You owe me 100 credits, but I'll defer collection. They made the trip back to York City in virtual silence. Either Hawks was too tactful to ask the reasons for Alan's decision, or else this seemed more likely. Alan decided the gambler had already made some shrewd surmises and was waiting for time to bear him out. Hawks had known long before Alan himself realized it that he would not leave with the Valhalla. The Cavor hyperdrive, that was the rainbow's end Alan would chase now. He would accept Hawks' offer, become the gambler's protege, learn a few things about life. The experience would not hurt him, and always in the front of his mind he would keep the ultimate goal of finding a space drive that would propel a ship faster than the speed of light. At the apartment in Hasbrook, Hawks offered him a drink. To celebrate our partnership, he explained. Alan accepted the drink and tossed it down. It stung momentarily. He saw sadly he was never going to make much of a drinking man. He drew something from his pocket and Hawks frowned. "What's that?" "My tally. Every spaceman has one. It's the only way we can keep track of our chronological ages when we're on board ship." He showed it to Hawks. It read, "Year 17, Day 3. Every 24 hours of subjective time that goes by, we click off another day. Every 365 days, another year is ticked off. But I guess I won't be needing this anymore." He tossed it in the disposal unit. "I'm an Earther now. Every day that goes by is just one day. Objective time and subjective time are equal." Hawks grinned cheerfully. "A little plastic doodad to tell you how old you are, hey? Well, that's all behind you now." He pointed to a button in the wall. "There's the operating control for your bed. I'll sleep in back where I did last night. First thing tomorrow we'll get you a decent set of clothes so you can walk down the street without having people yell 'Spacer' at you. Then I want you to meet a few people, friends of mine, and then we can start breaking you in at the Class C tables." The first few days of life with Hawks were exciting ones. The gambler bought Alan new clothing, modern stuff with self-sealing zippers and pressure buttons, made of filmy, clingy materials that were incredibly more comfortable than the rough cloth of his Valhalla uniform. York City seemed less strange to him with each passing hour. He studied undertube routes and overshoot maps until he knew his way around the city fairly well. Each night about 1800 they would sit, eat, and then it was time to go to work. Hawks' routine brought him to 3 different Class A gambling parlors twice each week. On the 7th day he always rested. For the first week Alan followed Hawks around, standing behind him and observing his technique. When the second week began, Alan was on his own, and he began to frequent the Class C places near the A parlors Hawks used. But when he asked Hawks whether he should take out a free status registration, the gambler replied with a quick, snappish, "Not yet." "But why? I'm a professional gambler since last week. Why shouldn't I register?" "Because you don't need to. It's not required." "But I want to. Gosh, Max, I sort of want to put my name down on something, just to show I belong here on Earth. I want to register." Hawks looked at him strangely, and it seemed to Alan there was menace in the calm blue eyes. In sudden ominous tones he said, "I don't want you signing your name to anything, Alan, or registering for free status. Got that?" "Yes, but—" "No buts. Got it?" Repressing his anger, Alan nodded. He was used to taking orders from his shipboard superiors and obeying them. Hawks probably knew best. In any case, he was dependent on the older man right now, and did not want to anger him unnecessarily. Hawks was wealthy. It might take money to build a hyperdrive ship, when the time came. Alan was flatly cold-blooded about it, and the concept surprised and amused him when he realized just how single-minded he had become since resigning from the Valhalla. He turned the single-mindedness to good use at the gaming tables first. During his initial 10 days as a professional, he succeeded in losing 700 credits of Hawks' money, even though he did manage to win a 300-credit stake one evening. But Hawks was not worried. "You'll make the grade, Alan. A few more weeks, days maybe, while you learn the combinations, limber up your fingers, pick up the knack of thinking fast. You'll get there." "I'm glad you're so optimistic." Alan felt downcast. He had dropped 300 credits that evening, and it seemed to him that his fumbling fingers would never learn to set up the combinations fast enough. He was just like Steve, a born loser, without the knack of the game required. Oh well, it's your money. "And I expect you to double it for me someday. I've got a 5-to-1 bet out now that you'll make Class B before fall." Alan snorted doubtfully. In order to make Class B, he would have to make average winnings of 200 credits a night for 10 days running, or else win 3,000 credits within a month. It seemed a hopeless task. But as usual, Hawks won the bet. Alan's luck improved as May passed and June dwindled. At the beginning of July he hit a hot streak when he seemed to be marching up to the winner's rostrum every other round, and the other Class C patrons began to grumble. The night he came home with 600 newly won credits, Hawks opened a drawer and took out a slim, sleek neutrino gun. "You'd better carry this with you from now on," said the gambler. "What for?" "They're starting to notice you now. I hear people talking. They know you're carrying cash out of the games parlors every night." Alan held the cool gray weapon, whose muzzle could spit a deadly stream of energized neutrinos, undetectable, massless, and fatal. "If I'm held up, I'm supposed to use this?" "Just the first time," Hawks said. "If you do the job right, you won't need to use it anymore. There won't be any second time." As it turned out, Alan had no need for the gun, but he carried it within easy reach whenever he left the apartment. His skill at the game continued to increase. It was, he saw, just like astrogation, and with growing confidence he learned to project the moves 3, sometimes 4 numbers ahead. On a warm night in mid-July, the proprietor of the games hall Alan frequented most regularly stopped him as he entered. "You're Donnell, aren't you?" "That's right. Anything wrong?" "Not much, except that I've been tallying up your take these past 2 weeks. Comes close to 3,000 credits altogether, which means you're not welcome around this parlor anymore. Nothing personal, son. You'd better carry this with you next time out." Alan took a little card the proprietor offered him. It was made of gray plastic, and imprinted on it in yellow were the letters Class B. He had been promoted. Chapter 13. Things were not quite so easy in the Class B games parlors. Competition was rough. Some of the players were, like Alan, sharp newcomers just up from the bottom of the heap. Others were former Class A men who were sliding down again, but still did well enough to hang on in Class B. Every day some of the familiar faces were gone, as one man after another failed to meet the continuing qualifications for the intermediary class. Alan won fairly steadily, and Hawks, of course, was a consistent winner on the Class A level. Alan turned his winnings over to the older man, who then allowed him to draw any cash he might need without question. The summer rolled on through August, hot and sticky, despite the best efforts of the local Weather Adjustment Bureau. The cloud seeders provided a cooling rain shower at about 0100 every night to wash away the day's grime. Alan was usually coming home at that time, and he would stand in the empty streets letting the rain pelt down on him, and enjoying it. Rain was a novelty for him. He had spent so much of his life aboard the starship that he had had little experience with it. He was looking forward to the coming of winter, and with it snow. He hardly ever thought of the Valhalla. He disciplined himself to keep thoughts of the starship out of his mind, for he knew that once he began regretting his decision, there would be no stopping. Life on Earth was endlessly fascinating, and he was confident that some day soon he would get a chance to begin tracking down the Cavor hyperdrive. Hawks taught him many things: how to wrestle, how to cheat at cards, how to throw knives. None of the things Alan learned from Hawks were proper parts of an education of a virtuous young man, but on Earth, virtue was a negative accomplishment. You were either quick or dead. And until he had had the opportunity to start work on the hyperdrive, Alan knew he had better learn how to survive on Earth. Hawks was a master of survival techniques. Alan was a good student. He had his first test on a muggy night early in September. He had spent his evening at the Lido, a flossy games parlor in the suburb of Ridgewood, and had come away with better than 700 credits, the second best single night he had ever had. He felt good about things. Hawks was working at a parlor across the city, and so they did not arrange to meet when the evening was over. Instead, they planned to come home separately. Usually they talked for an hour or two each night before turning in, Alan reviewing his evening's work and having Hawks pick out the weak points in his technique and show him the mistakes he had made. Alan reached Hasbrook about 0030 that evening. There was no moon, and in Hasbrook the street lighting was not as efficient as it was in more respectable areas of York City. The streets were dark. Alan was perspiring heavily from the humidity. But the faint hum of the Cloud-Seeder helicopters could be heard. The evening rain was on the way. He decided to wait outside a while. The first drop splashed down about 0045. Alan grinned gleefully as the cool rain washed away the sweat that clung to him. While pedestrians scurried for cover, he gloried in the downpour. Darkness lay all around. Alan heard sudden footsteps. A moment later he felt sharp pressure in the small of his back and a hand gripping his shoulder. A quiet voice said, "Hand over your cash and you won't get hurt." Alan froze just an instant. Then the months of Hawk's training came into play. He wiggled his back tentatively to see whether the knife was penetrating his clothing. Good, it wasn't. In one quick motion he whirled and spun away, dancing off to the left and clubbing down sharply on his opponent's knife hand. A grunted exclamation of pain rewarded him. He stepped back 2 steps. As his attacker advanced, Alan drove a fist into his stomach and leapt lithely away again. This time his hand emerged holding the neutrino gun. "Stand where you are, or I'll burn you," he said quietly. The shadow-shrouded attacker made no move. Cautiously, Alan kicked the fallen knife out of his reach, without lowering his gun. "Okay," Alan said. "Come over here in the light where I can see who you are. I want to remember you." But to his astonishment he felt strong arms slipping around him and pinioning him. A quick twist and his neutrino gun dropped from his numbed hands. The arms locked behind his back in an unbreakable full Nelson. Alan writhed, but it was no use. The hidden accomplice held him tightly. And now the other man came forward and efficiently went through his pockets. Alan felt more angry than afraid, but he wished Hawks or someone else would come along before this thing went too far. Suddenly Alan felt the pressure behind his neck easing up. His captor was releasing him. He poised, debating whether or not to whirl and attack, when a familiar voice said, "Rule number 1. Never leave your back unguarded for more than half a second when you're being held up. You see what happens?" Alan was too stunned to reply for several moments. In a whisper he said finally, "Max?" "Of course. And lucky for you, I'm who I am, too. John, step out here in the light where he can see you. Alan, meet John Byng, free status, Class B." The man who had originally attacked him came forward now into the light of the street glow. He was shorter than Alan, with a lean, almost fleshless face and a scraggly reddish-brown beard. He looked cadaverous. His eyeballs were stained a peculiar yellowish tinge. Alan recognized him, a Class B man he had seen several times at various parlors. It was not a face one forgot easily. Byng handed over the thick stack of bills he had taken from Alan. As he pocketed them, Alan said in some annoyance, "A very funny prank, Max, but suppose I had burned your friend's belly or he had stabbed me." Hawks chuckled. "One of the risks of the game, I guess. But I know you too well to think you'd burn down an unarmed man, and John didn't intend to stab you. Besides, I was right here. And what was the point of this little demonstration?" "Part of your education, my boy. I was hoping you'd be held up by one of the local gangs, but they didn't oblige, so I had to do it myself. With John's help, of course. Next time, remember that there may be an accomplice hiding in the shadows, and that you're not safe just because you've caught one man." Alan grinned. "Good point, and I guess this is the best way to learn it." The 3 of them went upstairs. Byng excused himself and vanished into the extra room almost immediately. Hawks whispered to Alan, "Johnny's a dream duster, a narcocephrine addict. In the early stages you can spot it by the yellowing of the eyeballs. Later on it'll cripple him, but he doesn't worry about later on." Alan studied the small, lean man when he returned. Bing was smiling, a strange, unworldly smile. He held a small plastic capsule in his right hand. "Here's another facet of your education," he said. He looked at Hawks. "Is it okay?" Hawks nodded. Bing said, "Take a squint at this capsule, boy. It's dream dust, narcocephrine. That's my kick." He tossed the capsule nonchalantly to Alan, who caught it and held it arm's distance away as if it were a live viper. It contained a yellow powder. "You twist the cap off and sniff a little," he said. "But don't try it unless you hate yourself real bad. Johnny can testify to that." Alan frowned. "What does the stuff do?" "It's a stimulant, a nerve stimulant. Enhances perception. It's made from a weed that grows only in dry, arid places. Comes from Ypsilon eridani 4 originally, but the galaxy's biggest plantation is in the Sahara. It's habit-forming and expensive." "How much of it do you have to take to get the habit?" Bing's thin lips curled in a cynical scowl. "One sniff, and the drug takes all your worries away. You're 9 feet tall and the world is your plaything when you're up on dream dust. Everything looks like it has 6 different colors." Bitterly, Bing said, "Just one catch. After about a year, you stop feeling the effect, but not the craving. That stays with you forever. Every night, one good sniff at 100 credits a sniff, and there's no cure." Alan shuddered. He had seen dream dust addicts in the advanced state, withered, palsied old men of 40, unable to eat, crippled, drying up and nearing death. And that's for a year's pleasure. "Johnny used to be a Starman," Hawk said suddenly. "That's why I picked him for our little stunt tonight. I thought it was about time I introduced you two." Alan's eyes widened. "What ship?" "Galactic Queen. A dream dust peddler came wandering through the Enclave one night and let me have a free sniff. Generous of him." "And you became an addict?" "5 minutes later. So my ship left without me. That was 11 years ago, Earth time. Figure it out. 100 credits a night for 11 years. Alan felt cold inside. It could have happened to him, he thought, that free sniff. Bing's thin shoulders were quivering. The advanced stage of addiction was starting to set in. Bing was only the first of Hawk's many friends that Alan met in the next 2 weeks. Hawks was the center of a large group of men in free status, not all of whom knew each other, but who all knew Hawks. Alan felt a sort of pride in being the protege of such an important and well-known man as Max Hawks, until he started discovering what sort of people Hawks' friends were. There was Lorne Hollis, the loansman, one of the men Steve had borrowed from. Hollis was a chubby, almost greasy individual with flat, milky gray eyes and a cold, chilling smile. Alan shook hands with him and then felt like wiping off his hand. Hollis came to see them often. Another frequent visitor was Mike Kovac of the Bryson Syndicate, a sharp-looking businessman type in ultra-modern suits, who spoke clearly and well, and whose specialty was forgery. There was Al Weber, an amiable, soft-spoken little man who owned a fleet of small ion-drive cargo ships that plied the space lines between Earth and Mars, and who also exported dream dust to the colony on Pluto, where the weed could not be grown. 7 or 8 others showed up occasionally at Hawk's apartment. Alan was introduced to them all, and then generally dropped out of the conversation, which usually consisted of reminiscences and gossip about people he did not know. But as the days passed, one thing became evident. Hawks might not be a criminal himself, but certainly most of his friends operated on the far side of the law. Hawks had seen to it that they stayed away from the apartment during the first few months of Alan's Earther education, but now that the ex-Starman was an accomplished gambler and fairly well skilled in self-defense, all of Hawks' old friends were returning once again. Day by day, Alan increasingly realized how innocent and childlike a Starman's life was. The Valhalla was a placid little world of 176 people, bound together by so many ties that there was rarely any conflict. Here on Earth, though, life was tough and hard. He was lucky he had stumbled into Hawks early in his wanderings. With a little less luck, he might have had the same sort of life Steve had, or John Byng. It was not fun to think about that. Usually when Hawks had friends visiting him late at night, Alan would sit up for a while listening, and then excuse himself and get some sleep. As he lay in bed, he could hear low whispering, and once he woke toward morning and heard the conversation still going on. He strained his ears, but he did not pick up anything. One night early in October he had come home from the games parlor, and finding nobody home, had gone immediately to sleep. Some time later he heard Hawks and his friends come in, but he was too tired to get out of bed and greet them. He rolled over and went back to sleep. But later that night he felt hands touching him, and he opened an eye to see Hawks bending over him. "It's me, Max. Are you awake?" "No," Alan muttered indistinctly. Hawks shook him several times. "Come on, get up and put some clothes on. Some people here who want to talk to you." Only half comprehending, Alan clambered unwillingly from bed, dressed, splashed cold water in his face. He followed Hawks back inside. The room was crowded. 7 or 8 men were there, the ones Alan thought of as the inner circle of Hawks' cronies. John Byng, Mike Kovac, Al Weber, Lorne Hollis, and some others. Sleepily Alan nodded at them and took a seat, wondering why Hawks had dragged him out of bed for this. Hawks looked at him sharply. "Alan, you know all these people, don't you?" Alan nodded. He was still irritated at Hawks. He had been sound asleep. "You're now facing 90% of what we've come to call the Hawks Syndicate," Hawks went on. "These 8 gentlemen and myself have formed an organization recently for a certain specific purpose. More of that in a few minutes. What I got you out here to tell you was that there's room in our organization for one more man, and that you fit the necessary qualifications." "Me?" Hawks smiled. "You. We've all been watching you since you came to live with me, testing you, studying you. You're adaptable, strong, intelligent. You learn fast. We had a little vote tonight and decided to invite you in." Alan wondered if he were still asleep or not. What was all this talk of syndicates? He looked around the circle and realized that this bunch could be up to no good. Hawks said, "Tell him about it, Johnny." Byng leaned forward and blinked his drug-stained eyes. In a quiet voice, almost a purr, he said, "It's really very simple. We're going to stage a good old-fashioned hold-up. It's a proposition that'll net each of us about 1 million credits, even with a 10-way split. It ought to go off pretty easy, but we need you in on it. As a matter of fact, I'd say you were indispensable to the project, Alan." Chapter 14. Hawks took over, explaining the proposition to a now very much awake Alan. "There's going to be a currency transfer at the World Reserve Bank downtown next Friday. At least 10 million credits are going to be picked up by an armored truck and taken to branch banks for distribution. Hollis here happens to have found out the wave pattern of the robo-guards who will be protecting the currency shipment, and Alan Weber has some equipment that can paralyze robo-guards if we know their operational wavelength. So it's a simple matter to leave the car unprotected. We wait till it's loaded, then blank out the robots, seize the human guards, and drive away with the truck." Alan frowned thoughtfully. Why am I so indispensable to this business? He had no desire to rob banks or anything else. Because you're the only one of us who isn't registered on the central directory. You don't have any televector number. You can't be traced." Suddenly Alan understood. "So that's why you didn't let me register? You've been grooming me for this all along?" Hawks nodded. "As far as Earth is concerned, you don't exist. If any of us drove off with that truck, all they need to do is plot the truck's coordinates and follow the televector patterns of the man who's driving it. Capture is inevitable that way. But if you're aboard the truck, there's no possible way of tracing your route. Get it?" "I get it," Alan said slowly, "but I don't like it," he added silently. "I want to think about the deal a little longer, though. Let me sleep on it. I'll tell you tomorrow whether I'll go through with it." Puzzled expressions appeared on the faces of Hawks' 8 guests, and Weber started to say something, but Hawks cut him hastily off. "The boy's a little sleepy, that's all. He needs time to get used to the idea of being a millionaire. I'll call each of you in the morning, okay?" The 8 were shepherded out of the apartment rapidly, and when they were gone, Hawks turned to face Alan. Gone now was the bland friendliness, gone the warm-hearted brotherliness of the older man. His lean face was cold and businesslike now, and his voice was harsh as he said, "What's this talk of thinking it over? Who said you had any choice about this thing?" "Don't I have any say in my own life?" Alan said hotly. "Suppose I don't want to be a bank robber. You didn't tell me." "I didn't need to. Listen, boy, I didn't bring you in here for my health. I brought you in because I saw you had the potential for this job. I've coddled you along for more than 3 months now, given you a valuable education in how to get along on this planet. Now I'm asking you to pay me back, a little." Bing told the truth. You're indispensable to this project. Your personal feelings are irrelevant just now. "Who says?" "I do." Alan stared coldly at Hawks' transformed face. "Max, I didn't bargain for a share in your bank robbing syndicate. I don't want any part of it. Let's call it quits right now. I've turned over quite a few thousand credits of my winnings to you. Give me 500 and keep the rest. It's your pay for my room and board and the instruction the last 3 months. You go your way, I'll go mine." Hawks laughed sharply. "Just as simple as that. I pocket your winnings and you walk out of here? How dumb do you think I am? You know the names of the syndicate, you know the plans, you know everything. A lot of people would pay big money for an advance tip on this bit." He shook his head. "I'll go my way and you'll go it too, Alan, or else. You know what that or else means?" Angrily, Alan said, "You'd kill me too if I back down now. Friendship doesn't mean a thing to you. Help us rob this bank or else." Hawks' expression changed again. He smiled warmly, and when he spoke his voice was almost wheedling. "Listen, Alan, we've been planning this thing for months. I put down 7,000 to clear your brother, just so I'd be sure of getting your cooperation. I tell you there's no danger. I didn't mean to threaten you, but try to see my side of it. You have to help out." Alan looked at him curiously. "How come you're so hot to rob the bank, Max? You earn a fortune every night. You don't need 1,000,000 more credits." "No, I don't. But some of them do. Johnny Bing does, and Kovac too. He owes Bryson 30,000. But I organized the scheme." Hawks was pleading now. "Alan, I'm bored. Deadly bored. Gambling isn't gambling for me. I'm too good. I never lose except when I want to. So I need to get my kicks someplace else. This is it. But it won't come off without you." They were silent for a moment. Alan realized that Hawks and his group were desperate men. They would never let him live if he refused to cooperate. He had no choice at all. It was disillusioning to discover that Hawks had taken him in mostly because he would be useful in a robbery. He tried to tell himself that this world was a jungle where morality didn't matter, and that the million credits he'd gain would help finance hyperdrive research. But those were thin arguments that held no conviction. There was no justification for what he was going to do, none whatsoever. But Hawks held him in a cleft stick. There was no way out. He had fallen among thieves, and willy-nilly he would be forced to become one of them. "All right," he said bitterly. "I'll drive the getaway truck for you. But after it's over, I'll take my share and get out. I won't want to see you again." Hawks seemed to look hurt, but he masked the emotion quickly enough. "That's up to you, Alan, but I'm glad you gave in. It would have been rough on both of us otherwise. Suppose we get some sleep." Alan slept poorly during what was left of the night. He kept mulling the same thoughts round and round endlessly in his head, until he wished he could unhinge the front of his skull and let the thoughts escape somehow. It irritated him to know that Hawks had taken him in, primarily because he fit the qualifications for a plan concocted long before, and not for his own sake. All the intensive training the gambler had given him had been directed not merely toward toughening Alan, but toward preparing him for the role he would play in the projected robbery. He felt unhappy about the robbery, too. The fact that he was being coerced into taking part made him no less a criminal, and that went against all his long-ingrained codes of ethics. He would be just as guilty as Hawks or Weber, and there was no way out. There was no sense brooding over it, he decided finally. When it was all over, he would have enough money to begin aiming for his real goal, development of a workable hyperspace drive. He would break completely with Hawks, move to some other city perhaps. If his quest were successful, it would in some measure be an atonement for the crime he was going to commit. Only in some measure, though. The week passed slowly, and Alan did poorly at his nightly work. His mind was anywhere but on the flashing games board, and the permutations and combinations eluded him. He lost, though not heavily. Each night the 10 members of the syndicate met at Hawks' apartment and planned each step of the crime in great detail, drilling and re-drilling until it was second nature for each man to recite his particular part in the robbery. Alan's was at once the simplest and most difficult. He would have nothing to do until the others had finished their parts, but then he would have to board the armored car and outrace any pursuers. He was to drive the car outside the city limits, where he would be met and relieved of the cash by Bing and Hollis. Then he was to lose the truck somewhere and return to the city by public transport. The day of the robbery dawned cold and clear. An autumn chill was in the air. Alan felt some anticipatory nervousness, but he was calmer than he expected to be, almost fatalistically calm. By nightfall he would be a wanted criminal. He wondered whether it would be worth it, even for the million credits. Perhaps it would be best to defy Hawks and make some sort of escape try. But Hawks, as always a shrewd judge of human character, seemed obviously aware that Alan was wavering. He kept a close watch over him, never allowing him to stray. Hawks was taking no chances. He was compelling Alan to take part in the robbery. The currency transfer was scheduled to take place at 12:40, according to the inside information that Hollis had somehow obtained. Shortly after noon, Hawks and Alan left the apartment and boarded the Undertube, their destination the downtown section of York City, where the World Reserve Bank was located. They reached the bank about 12:30. The armored truck was parked outside, looking sleek and impregnable, and 4 massive robo-guards stood watch, one at each wheel. There were 3 human policemen too, but they were strictly for effect. In case of any trouble, the robo-guards were expected to handle the rough work. The bank was a mighty edifice indeed, over 100 stories high, rising in sweeping setbacks to a point where its tapering top was lost in the shimmering noonday sky. It was, Alan knew, the center of global commerce. Armed guards were bringing packages of currency from within the bank and were placing them on the truck. Alan's heart raced. The streets were crowded with office workers out for lunch. Could he get away with it? It was all precisely synchronized. As Hawks and Alan strolled toward the bank, Alan caught sight of Kovac lounging across the street, reading a telefax sheet. None of the others were visible. Weber, Alan knew, was at this moment sitting in an office overlooking the bank entrance, staring out the window at the scene below. At precisely 12:40, Weber was to throw the switch on the wave damper that would paralyze the 4 roboguards. The instant the roboguards froze, the other conspirators would go into action. Jensen, McGuire, Freeman, and Smith, donning masks, would leap for the 3 human guards of the truck and pin them to the ground. Bing and Hawks, who would enter the bank a moment before, would stage an impromptu fist fight with each other just inside the main entrance, thereby creating confusion and making it difficult for reinforcement guards to get past them and into the street. Just outside the door, Hollis and Kovac would lurk. As the quartet pounced on the truck's guards, they would sprint across and yank the driver out of the cab. Then Alan would enter quickly from the other side and drive off, while the remaining 9 would vanish into the crowd as many different directions as possible. Bing and Hollis, if they got away, would head for the rendezvous to meet Alan and take the cash from him. If it went off properly, the whole thing should take less than 15 seconds from the time Weber threw the switch to the time Alan drove away with the truck. If it went off properly. The seconds crawled by. The time was 12:35 now. At 12:37, Hawks and Bing sauntered into the bank from opposite directions. 3 minutes to go. Alan's false calm deserted him. He pictured all sorts of possible calamities. 12:38. Everyone's watch was synchronized to the second. 12:39. 12:39:30. 30 seconds to go. Alan took his position in a crowd of bystanders as prearranged. 15 seconds to go. 10. 5. 12:40. The roboguards were in the act of redirecting the locking of the truck. The loading had been carried out precisely on schedule. The truck was sealed. The roboguards froze. Weber had been right on time. Alan tensed, caught up in the excitement of the moment, and thinking now only of the part he was to play. The 3 policemen glanced at each other in some confusion. Jensen and McGuire came leaping out at them. And the roboguards returned to life. The sound of blaster shots was heard within the bank. Alan whirled, startled. 4 guards came racing out of the building, blasters drawn. What had happened to Hawks and Bing? Why weren't they obstructing the entrance as it had been arranged? The street was a scene of wild confusion now. People milled everywhere. Alan saw Jensen writhing in the steel grip of a roboguard. Had Weber's device failed? Evidently so. Alan was unable to move. He saw Freeman and McGuire streaking wildly down the street with police in keen pursuit. Hollis stood staring dumbly inside the bank door. Alan saw Kovac come running toward him. "Everything's gone wrong," Kovac whispered harshly. "The cops were waiting for us. Bing and Hawks are dead. Come on, run if you want to save yourself." Chapter 15. Alan sat very quietly in the empty apartment that had once belonged to Hawks, and he stared at nothing in particular. It was 5 hours since the abortive robbery. He was alone. The news had been blared out over every form of communication there was. He knew the story by heart. A daring robbery had been attempted, but police detection methods had yielded advanced warning, and the robbers had been frustrated. The roboguards had been specially equipped ones, which could shift to an alternate wavelength in case of emergency. They had blinked out only momentarily. And special guards had been posted within the bank, ready to charge out. Bing and Hawks had tried to block the doorway, and they had been shot down. Hawks was killed instantly. Bing died an hour later in the hospital. At least 2 other members of the gang had been apprehended, Jensen and Smith, both trapped by the roboguards. It was known that at least 2 other men, and possibly more, had participated in the attempt, and these were being traced now. Alan was not worried. He had not been within 100 feet of the crime, and it had been easy for him to slip away unnoticed. The others had had little difficulty either: Weber, Hollis, Kovac, McGuire, and Freeman. There was a chance that Hollis or Kovac had been recognized. In that case, they could be tracked down by televector. But Alan was not registered on the televector screens, and there was no other way of linking him with the crime. He glanced around the apartment at Hawk's bar and his audio system and all the dead man's other things. Yesterday, Alan thought, Hawks had been here, alive, eyes sparkling as he outlined the plans for his robbery a final time. Now he was dead. It was hard to believe that such a many-sided person could have been snuffed out so soon, so quickly. A thought occurred. The police would be investigating the disposition of Hawks' property. They would want to know the relationship between Hawks and Alan, and perhaps there would be questions asked about the robbery. Alan decided to forestall that. He reached for the phone. He would call security, tell them he had been living with Hawks, and that he had heard of the gambler's sudden violent death, and in all innocence ask for details. He would... The door announcer chimed. Alan whirled and put down the receiver. Reaching out, he flicked on the door screen and was shown a view of a distinguished-looking, middle-aged man in the silver-gray uniform of the police. So soon, Alan thought. I didn't even get a chance to call. "Who is it?" he asked in a surprisingly even voice. "Inspector Gaynor of Global Security." Alan opened the door. Inspector Gaynor smiled warmly, walked in, took the seat that Alan offered him. Alan felt tense and jumpy, and hoped not too much of it showed. The security man said, "Your name is Alan Donnell, isn't it? And you're a free status man, unregistered, employed as a professional gamesman, Class B?" Alan nodded. "That's right, sir." Gaynor checked a notation on a pad he carried. "I suppose you've heard that the man who lived here, Max Hawks, was killed in an attempted robbery this morning?" "Yes, sir. I heard it a little while ago on the newscasts. I'm still a little shaken up. Would you care for a drink, Inspector?" "Not on duty, thanks," Gaynor said cheerfully. "Tell me, Alan, how long did you know Max Hawks?" "Since last May. I'm an ex-Starman. I jumped ship. Max found me wandering around the city and took me in. But I never knew anything about any robberies, Inspector. Max kept his mouth pretty well sealed most of the time. When he left here this morning, he said he was going to the bank to make a deposit. I never thought—" He stopped, wondering whether he sounded convincing. At the moment, a long jail sentence or worse seemed inevitable. And the worst part of it was that he had not wanted to take place in the robbery. Indeed, he had not taken part, but in the eyes of the law he was undoubtedly as guilty as any of the others. Gaynor raised one hand. "Don't misunderstand, son. I'm not here as a criminal investigator. We don't suspect you had any part in the attempt." "Then why—" He drew an envelope from his breast pocket and unfolded the papers it contained. "I knew Max pretty well," he said. "About a week ago he came to see me and gave me a sealed envelope, which was to be opened only in the event of his death on this particular day, and to be destroyed unopened otherwise. I opened it a few hours ago. I think you ought to read it." With trembling fingers, Alan took the sheaf of papers and scanned them. They were neatly typed. Alan recognized the blocky purple characters of the voice-write Hawks kept in his room. He started to read. The document explained that Hawks was planning a bank robbery to take place on Friday, October 3, 3876. He named none of his accomplices. He went on to state that one, Alan Donnell, an unregistered ex-Starman, was living with him, and that this Alan Donnell had no knowledge whatsoever of the intended bank robbery. Furthermore, Hawks added, in the event of my death in the intended robbery, Alan Donnell is to be sole heir and assign of my worldly goods. This supersedes and replaces any and all wills and testaments I may have made at any past time. Appended was a schedule of the properties Hawks was leaving behind. Accounts in various savings banks totaled some 750,000 credits. Besides that, there were scattered investments, real estate holdings, bonds. The total estate, Hawks estimated, was worth slightly over 1,000,000 credits. When Alan finished, he looked up, startled and white-faced, at the older man. All of this mine? You're a pretty rich young man, Gaynor agreed. Of course, there are formalities. The will has to be probated and contested, and you can expect it to be contested by somebody. If you still have the full estate when the courts get through with you, you'll be all right. Alan shook his head uncomprehendingly. The way he wrote this, it's as if he knew. Hawks always knew, Gaynor said gently. He was the best hunchman I've ever seen. It was almost as if he could see a couple of days into the future all the time. Sure, he knew. And he always knew it was safe to leave this document with me, that he could trust me not to open it. Imagine announcing a week ahead of time that you're going to rob a bank, and then turning the announcement over sealed to a police officer. Alan started. The police officer had known about the robbery in advance. That was how Max and the dream duster Bing had been killed. Had Gaynor been the one who had betrayed them? Had he opened the sealed envelope ahead of time and sent Max to his death? No, it was inconceivable that this soft-spoken man would have done such a thing. Alan banished the thought. Max knew he was going to be killed, he said, and yet he went ahead with it. Why? Maybe he wanted to die, Gaynor suggested. Maybe he was bored with life, bored with always winning, bored with things as they were. The man was never born who could figure out Max Hawks anyway. You must have found that out yourself. Gaynor rose. I'll have to be moving along now, but let me give you some suggestions first. Sir? Go downtown and register yourself in free status. Have them give you a televector number. You're going to be an important person when you get all this money. And be very careful about who your friends are. Max could take care of himself. You may not be so lucky, son. Is there going to be an investigation of the robbery? Alan asked. It's underway already. You may be called down for some questioning, but don't let it worry you. I turned a copy of Max's will over to them today, and that exonerates you completely. It was strangely empty in the apartment that night. Alan wished Gaynor had stayed longer. He walked through the dark rooms, half expecting Max to come home. But Max wasn't coming home. Alan realized he had been tremendously fond of Hawks. He had never really shown it. He had never demonstrated much warmth toward the gambler, especially in the final days when they both lived under the pressure of the planned robbery. But Alan knew he owed much to Hawks, rogue and rascal though he was. Hawks had been basically a good man, gifted, too gifted perhaps, whose drives and passions led him beyond the boundaries of society. And at 35 he was dead, having known in advance that his day was at hand. The next few days were busy ones. Alan was called to security headquarters for questioning, but he insisted he knew nothing about the robbery or Hawk's friends, and the document Hawkes had left seemed to bear him out. He was cleared of all complicity in the robbery. Next he went to Central Directory Matrix and registered in free status. He was given a televector transmitter. It was surgically embedded in the fleshy part of his thigh, and he accepted a drink from fat old Heinz McIntosh in remembrance of Hawkes. He spoke briefly with McIntosh about the process of collecting on Hawk's estate, and learned it was a complex process, but nothing to be afraid of. The will was being sent through channels now. He met Hollis in the street several days later. The bloated loansman looked pale and harried, and his skin hung flabbily over his bones now. Little as Alan liked the loansman, he insisted on taking him to a local restaurant for lunch. "How come you're still hanging around York City?" Alan asked. "I thought the heat was on for any of Max's old buddies." "It is," Hollis said, wiping sweat from his white, shiny forehead. "But so far I'm in the clear. There won't be much of an investigation. They killed 2 and caught 2, and that'll make them happy. After all, the robbery was a failure." "Any notion why it failed?" Hollis nodded. "Sure, I have a notion. It was Kovac who tipped them off." "Mike? But he looked okay to me." "And to everybody, but he owed Bryson a lot, and Bryson was anxious to dispose of Max. So Kovac turned the plans of the robbery over to Bryson's boys in exchange for a quitclaim on the money he owed, and Bryson just forwarded it all on to the police. They were waiting for us when we showed up." That cleared Gaynor, Alan thought in some relief. "How did you find this all out?" "Bryson himself told me." "What?" "I guess he didn't know exactly who besides Max was in on the deal. Anyway, he certainly didn't know I was part of the group," Hollis said. "Old man Bryson was laying off some bets with me, and he let something slip about how he tipped the police to Max. Then he told me the whole thing." "And Kovac?" "Dead," Hollis said bluntly. "Bryson must have figured that if he'd sell Max out, he'd sell anybody out, so Kovac got taken care of. He was found yesterday. Heart failure, the report said. Bryson has some good drugs. Say, kid, any word yet on what's going to happen to all Max's dough?" Alan thought a moment before replying. "I haven't heard a thing. I guess the government inherits it?" "That would be too bad," Hollis said speculatively. "Max was well loaded. I'd like to get my hands on some of that dough myself. So would Bryson and his bunch, I'd bet." Alan said nothing. When he was through eating, he paid the check and left. Hollis headed north, Alan south. In 3 days, Hawk's will would go through the courts. Alan wondered if Bryson, who seemed to be York City's major criminal syndicate man, would try to angle some share of Max's money. A Bryson man did show up at the hearing, a slick-looking operator named Berwin. His claim was that Hawkes had been affiliated with Bryson for a number of years, and that Hawkes' money should revert to Bryson for virtue of an obscure law of the last century, involving the estates of professional gamblers killed in criminal actions. The robocomputer who was in charge of the hearing pondered the request a few moments. Then relays clicked, and the left-hand panel on the computer face lit up with a bright red "Application denied" signal. Berwin spoke for 3 minutes, ending up with a request that the robocomputer disqualify itself from the hearing and allow itself to be replaced by a human judge. The computer's decision was even quicker this time. Application denied. Berwin tossed Alan's side of the courtroom a black look and yielded ground. Alan had engaged a lawyer recommended once by Hawkes, a man named Jesperson. Briefly and concisely, Jesperson cited Alan's claim to the money, read the terms of the will, and stepped back. The computer considered Jesperson's plea for a few moments, reviewing the brief which the lawyer had taped and fed into the computer earlier. Time passed. Then the green panel lit and the words "Application Granted." Alan smiled. Bryson had been defeated. Max's money was his. Money that could be turned toward intensified research on the hyperdrive. "Well, son?" Jesperson asked. "How does it feel to be a millionaire?"